Eliane from Patchwork and Poodles. Let's make some scrappy half square triangles together. These scrappy half square triangles are a great way to use up scraps, and you can incorporate them in different quilt projects. You can also use them for some of the free tutorials on my site, including the Scrappy Heart and the Scrappy Throw Pillows. There are 2 different throw pillows to choose from as well. I'm going to link all of those tutorials in the description below. Go ahead and check those out when you're done with this video. Today, we're going to use the 2 at a time half square triangle method to create half square triangles that finish at 5.5 inches. If you want to make half square triangles in a different size or using a different method, such as the 4 at a time or the 8 at a time, I have a really handy calculator tool on my website that will calculate the size squares that you need for any size half square triangle. You simply put in the finished size half square triangle that you want, and the calculator will tell you what size squares to cut. It's super easy. I'll link that in the description below as well. And just a reference, half square triangles, when we're talking about the finished size, we mean the size when it's sewn into your project. So when we're going to be trimming them up, once we've made them, we're going to want them to finish a ½ inch bigger than our finished size, which means they'll trim to 6 inches so that when we sew them in our project, they're going to finish at 5.5 inches. I'll show you 3 different ways of creating these scrappy half square triangles, but feel free to get creative with your scraps. Maybe you have different widths or different length scraps that I do. Maybe you're trying to incorporate a different color. This is to get you started and make you feel confident to go ahead and be creative with what you have at home. To get started, you're going to first need some background fabric. You're also going to need a whole variety of scraps. I pulled out a whole bunch of scraps here. Small skinny scraps, bigger pieces. I've pulled out some pieces of binding left over, some little offcut triangles here. This is from making binding. I saved my little triangles. So what you might have at home might be different from me. It's pulled out a whole bunch of scraps that kind of coordinate in a color that I like. I wanted to go with bright and playful, almost mid-century with some of these greens, avocado-y orange. In addition to all of my scraps that came from little pieces when I'm done with my quilt, what I also have in my scrap bin, and maybe you do too, is a lot of like orphan blocks or little strips from strip piecing. These are left over from making a different quilts. I've got some little economy blocks or square and a square blocks, things that I was working on and maybe just never turned into a full project. These are also really great to use up in your scrappy half square triangles. When you end up using these and you cut them up by making the half square triangles, they kind of take on a new life of their own. They look completely different, they look super scrappy and unique, and so these are a really good one to pull out too. If you've got some scraps in your scrap bin from making a quilt, these are perfect for our project today. And then I chose a background fabric that I thought would coordinate well. So this is like a peachy pink color. You're also going to need a rotary cutter, a ruler, your iron, your sewing machine, a cutting mat, and some tools that are kind of handy. A pair of scissors, seam ripper, everyone's favorite, and then some sort of marking utensil. I'm going to use a pencil today so that you can hopefully see my marks through the video, but if you're doing this at home, I have a whole video on my favorite marking tools to use when quilting. So go ahead and check that out once you finish with this video. How much background fabric you're going to need is really dependent on how many half square triangles you want to make and what size you're making them. Today we're going to make 5.5 inch finished half square triangles, so we're going to cut our background squares at 6.5 inches. We can get 6 squares out of one width of fabric length. So when I cut a strip of fabric that's 42 inches long, I can cut 6.5 inch squares out of that. That's going to give me a total of 12 half square triangles once I'm done, because every square is going to give me 2 half square triangles. So how much background fabric you need really depends on what kind of project you're doing. If you're doing a pillow, you probably don't need as many. If you're going to go and make a whole quilt, you probably want to get quite a bit of background fabric to get you started. So we're going to start by prepping our background fabric. We're going to get that ready, we're going to put it to the side, and then we'll be ready to dive into our scraps and have a lot of fun with those. I've pulled out several rulers today. The one that I'm going to use for cutting out my background is going to be the 6.5 inch by 24 inch ruler. This is my my ride or die ruler. I use this one for every project. It's my favorite ruler. I also have a couple other rulers that I pulled out because I thought they might be handy for this project. For example, this is a 6.5-inch square ruler. Because we're going to be cutting our squares to 6.5 inches, I thought that this might be really handy to check the size of my Scrappy blocks as I was sewing them together. I want to make sure that they're the right size, and so I want to make sure that they finish at least this size. So if you've got a smaller ruler around, this can be really helpful. I also pulled out this ruler, which is a 3-inch by 12-inch. And this one also has a grippy non-slide back. I really like this one for smaller scrap pieces. It's not as big or unwieldy as my large ruler, and so I'm able to use it to really manipulate those scraps a little bit better. So if you've got something like this around, this is a great one to have too. But if you're just getting started with quilting, this is the perfect ruler for you. You want to get something long and skinny, something that you can cut strips of fabric with, and I use this ruler for every project. Before I got some of the other ones, this is the one I pulled out. So if this is what you got, let's get started. So to get started, we're going to cut 6.5 inches times width of fabric, which means that I want to cut this whole strip with the fold in it to 6.5 inches. Because my rotary mat is a little small, I'm going to go ahead and fold mine in half. If you're using a large mat, you might not have to do that. I'm going to line up my folded edge and my selvage edge together. And the first thing you might notice is that these edges here don't quite line up. I'm going to cut that nice and straight first before I get started with everything else. With a nice straight cut on this side, I'm ready to cut 6.5 inches. My ruler is 6.5 inches wide, so it's really easy for me to line up the ruler edge with the edge of my cut fabric, which is nice and straight since I just cut it, and then I'm able to cut on this side. I prefer to use my ruler for my guide when cutting fabric versus my mat. I find it to be a little bit more consistent than trying to use the guidelines on my mat itself. Okay, so we have one cut, 6.5 inches by 42, because it's folded in half, right? So this is half and half. So now with this, my fabric is still folded up together, which is totally where we want it to be. What we're going to end up doing is we're going to subcut this into 6.5 inch squares. So we cut it this way 6.5, now we have to cut it this way 6.5. I'm going to start by cutting off that selvage edge. So I have a nice straight edge to start with. Making sure that my fabrics stay together. Pressing your fabrics before you start can be really helpful. So can starch. Starching your fabrics is just going to help it stabilize. I clearly did neither. So do as I say, not as I do. Okay, I'm going to flip this way since I am a righty. Now I have a straight edge on the left. I'm going to line up my ruler once more, 6.5 inches. My fabric is still folded together, and then I'm going to cut. So now when I take this apart, there we go, had a little thread holding on. Now when I take this apart, I have two 6.5 inch squares that are both evenly cut. I'm going to continue all down this row of fabric. I should be able to get a few more out of here. With all of my background squares cut, I now have to mark them so that they're ready to sew once we make our scrappy pieces. So each block I'm going to take, or each square that we cut, and I'm going to draw a line diagonally from corner to corner. Usually I would use a hair marker for this or a soluble marker made for quilting. I'm using a pencil today so that you can see my line through the camera. I have a video on what tools to use when marking your quilts, so you can go ahead and watch that as well if you are interested in learning more. So corner to corner, we're going to draw a line. It can sometimes be easier to start in the center and move yourself outwards one way, outwards the other way. For example, if it's lined up here, I can start here in the center, move towards the corner, and then move myself back. If you try to start in the corner, sometimes it can push up, with the pressure of the pencil or other marking utensil. With all my background squares cut and marked, we're going to set them aside, and it's now time to play with our scraps. I've already pulled out all the scraps that interest me for this project, so now the fun part is starting to pull them together. We're going to start by making a striped block. These are going to be some skinnier stripes. They're going to finish at 1 inch, so we're going to cut them at 1.5 inches, and they create a really fun, scrappy half square triangle block. So what I'm going to dig through in all of my scraps here is I'm looking for longer pieces. I need them to be skinny, sure, but that I can always cut down. What I do need that I can't really do otherwise is I need them to be at least 6.5 inches long, preferably 7 or 7.5 inches. I would rather sew them a little bit bigger and then cut them down to size than be dealing with smaller pieces that it just have to be exact. That can be kind of stressful, and this project is all about fun. So I need to find scraps that are at least 1.5 inches wide by 6.5 inches wide, and I'm going to need 6 of them for this. Here's a scrap. Oh, it's folded in half, so this one might be big enough. Sure is. This looks like about 2 inches. So let's take this one as one of ours. I'm going to show you with 6 identical stripes, each finishing at 1 inch. However, this stripy block can be made with any width of stripes. You definitely can make it with 2 inch wide or 3 inch wide and only have a couple in there. That's up to you. The other thing that's really up to you is whether you want to trim them straight or not. This piece here is definitely really crooked, and so I could choose to embrace the wonk and sew a whole bunch of these together kind of messily and create something really improv-y and with lots of movement, or I could decide that I want them to be really straight. That is 100% up to you to play around with and see what you like the best. For me today, I am going to go with straight, and we are going to make them 1.5 inches wide. Ho ho! Is this one long enough though? 1.5 inches wide by 6.5. Okay, so I know I said ideally they'd be a little bit longer, but I think we're gonna try to make it work because we got 2. Do we have more? Maybe. Let's see. Oh, here's some more blue. Here's a darker blue. This one would be fun. This one's definitely wide enough. I still like this one here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do a green. This looks wide enough. Okay, so that should be good. So these 2 guys we know are the right size. They're, 1.5. So I'm going to set these aside. I need to trim all of the rest of these down to 1.5 inches wide, but I'm going to keep them the length that they're at. I'm fine with them being a little bit longer. We're going to trim that later on. It's also really helpful to have a little jar or container or just a small trash can around you. All these little tidbits that you can just throw that in there. So here's my little scrap bucket. I just keep this next to my sewing machine, my projects, and it just gets filled up with all the scraps that are too small to keep. And then once this is full, I either throw it away or I have a friend who sometimes takes them. She makes dog beds for shelters and she fills it with fabric scraps. So here is one of my strips I just cut, right? So it's 1.5 inches wide. It's definitely longer than the blue ones, which are what we're going to trim them to. But we're just going to leave it for now. So I've got 2 light blue. I've got this golden color. Let's make a couple green and a dark blue. You could choose to do just 2 colors and alternate them. You can do like I'm doing and just random, all sorts of colors. You could do a rainbow. That would be a lot of fun. So really, sky's the limit. And this is just the first one. Okay, so now I have all my strips cut. I have to decide what order they're going to be in. I always like to line them up at the top and try to get that top edge really even. Sometimes it gets a little off, and that's okay. I just find it's a little bit easier if you've got one edge that you're trying to line up. It makes the blocks a little bit easier to square down the road as well. So I'm going to kind of determine how I want them to look. I like that. So now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine. I'm going to stitch all of these up and then come back here and press. With all my stripes sewn together, I'm going to now press all these seams open and then trim my block to 6.5 inches. It can be tempting to press your seams to one side. I find that they lay a little bit better all pressed open when put into my project, especially since these stripes are fairly skinny. It just looks a little less bulky this way. And then I'm going to take this over here. We're going to take our ruler, we're going to trim everything square. With my block trimmed square, I'm going to set it aside while I work on all of my other blocks. Let's move on to our second block. This is our Courthouse Steps inspired block. So for this one, we actually need to cut our pieces to size. With this Courthouse Steps inspired block, we want the pieces to be the right size so that our block finishes at the right size. We need a center square that's 3.5 inches. So let's start finding that one first. Based on my scraps, finding that center square might determine what I'm able to do after that. Oh, look at that. This looks like it might end up being the right candidate. I'm going to take out my little square ruler for this guy. Oh, it's a little small. I'd end up at the selvage edge. All right, let's find something else. I have a large scrap here, so I'm just going to go ahead and use this one instead. And from this, I'm going to cut out a 3.5 inch square. So that's going to be the center of my block. So I have the center. Let's figure out what's going to go on our left and right sides. So we need to find 2 rectangles, 2 inches by 3.5 inches. Those are going to go on the left and right sides of our center square. I'm eyeing up these light blues over here. I think that this would be a really fun color. I think playing with your scraps is a little bit of just play, right? So I'm auditioning different fabrics. This is a project that is just for fun. And so there really isn't a big amount of stress to get it right. You just get to play. You just get to see what comes out of your brain, your creativity. I love it. Okay, 2 more pieces for this block. These are going to be 6.5 inches wide, and they're going to go on the top and the bottom. So again, we're going to start digging and see what we find. So again, 2 by 6.5. And this one we actually want it to be 6.5 inches exactly. Becoming very primary colory. Let's throw in some of that light blue maybe. Alright, so now that I have all the pieces for this block, I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and sew it all together. For my Courthouse square block, just like for the stripes, I'm going to press all my seams open. This block doesn't require any other trimming. We already did what we needed to, so now I can set it aside and we're going to work on our final block. My final block is my favorite kind of block. This is a fully improv block. You just get to go nuts, have fun, check out all your scraps. Like this sort of thing because it uses up all these little weird sizes, right? All these little pieces that they end up in my scrap bin. They're not the right size for a project ever. And so they just end up languishing. But we can use them up in a really fun improv block. It's just what it sounds like. You just start sewing your scraps together till they're the right size to turn into a half square triangle. So for us, that's going to be 6.5 inches. What I like to do if you're looking for a little bit more guidance than go nuts, is I like to start with some smaller pieces and try to match them up and see what I get. So for example, I've got these two guys here. They're the same length. So I'm going to put those together. They're going to make something that's a little bit wider. Maybe I've got something else I can tack on the other side. Oh, well, I have this piece, right? Nope, that one's not big enough. Oh, this one. So this one's big enough. This one can go on the other side right there. And then we're gonna dig through, see what else we got here. I've been using a lot of blue. Let's try to pull in some of those yellows. The yellows that I tried to pull in, and they just weren't the right size. This is the perfect project to pull them into. So something like maybe here, and oh, there was a light blue square that can go here. So I'm starting to kind of build something out. I haven't sewn anything together yet, but this gives me a starting point. And what I do by this time is I'm going to go sew these together, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to put this and this together. So sew this, sew this, sew this, and then see where I'm at. How big is it? Where do I maybe want to add some more pieces and go from there? So this is kind of my building block to help me create that improv. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to sew these pieces up, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to see where we're at with them. With this block as well, just like every other block before it, press all your seams open. It's going to make it a lot easier when we're creating those half square triangles not to have any seams that are folded to one side. That adds a lot of bulk. It makes it really difficult to kind of sew those layers nicely together. So press open. Here's the beginning of our improv block that we started together, and what you'll notice is that even though this one was like a little bit longer in the beginning, now it's a lot longer because it only had one seam versus the two seams. So now we've really shrunken this first part of our improv block. So before I sew these two together, I have to make a decision. I can either cut this one down, or I can add more to the top piece and make that one a little bit longer. That's usually my preferred method, is not generating more scraps, but using them up. So I have this green piece here that I'd pulled out, and it's a little bit longer, but I think it would be the right width. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna use this one. I'm gonna sew it together, and what I can do is either sew it together and then trim, or trim ahead of time. My preferred method is just to sew it together and then trim straight. When I'm doing improv and nothing needs to match up, I don't necessarily worry about my pieces being a normal quilting length. So I don't worry about them being, 3.5 or 3 1/4. They might be 3 7/8, and that's okay with me because I don't need to match anything up. I just need them to match each other. So anything in a row, I'll stitch it together. I'll trim them straight. They might be a weird length. That's okay. And then I will move on and add more pieces to it. I like to press before I trim, so I'm going to go ahead and press this one too. So now I've got that piece. I'm going to take my ruler out, and I'm going to line up this seam. So I'm sewing pieces that are straight. If you're sewing pieces that are wonky, you're going to want to line up with maybe the top or bottom seam, or just pick a seam and then straighten from there. My pieces are straight, so I'm going to line it up with this seam, making sure that things look good all the way across, and then I am going to trim. There we go. Now, yes, so now that's beautiful. It matches up. I have a little bit of that selvage edge here, but it looks like it's going to be buried in my 1/4 inch seam allowance when I sew everything together. So I'm just going to leave it. That one I'm not too worried about. It's not in the center of my block. This length right now is, well, hot dang, that's 6.5 inches. So we're making really good progress on our improv block. I'm going to sew these two together and see how much length we still need before this block is ready to turn into a half square triangle. Trimming this straight, I'm going to take out my square ruler because we know now it's 6.5 inches. Super exciting. I did not plan that at all. You probably think I planned it, but I did not. 6.5 inches, but we got a little bit of length to go. This is only, whoop, 5.5. So we actually need another 1.5 inches at least. I'm going to aim for a section that's 2 inches wide, and then I'm just going to trim it after to get the correct size. No, maybe the darker blue. Yeah, I think this will be fun. Let's trim this down to 6.5 inches. Cut that off. So this is our super scrappy improv block. Now that we've done all of our blocks, it's time to sew them into half square triangles. And before I start, I'm actually going to cut one more block out, and that's going to be another one that we're going to do together. I am going to use my scrap. I'm going to cut a piece out of this and use it to make my half square triangle. I can use my 6.5 inch ruler. There. Okay, now I'm ready to get started sewing. What we're going to do is we're going to put together our scrappy block, stripey block, improv block, all of our fun blocks together, right sides together with a background piece. So we marked a diagonal line on all of our background pieces, and we marked it on the back side of our pieces. So now what we want to do is we want to put them together, right sides together, with that marking up. So the back of the fabric up. And we are going to sew 1/4 inch away from either side. So we're going to sew a 1/4 inch away from the line on either side of that line so that we're able to make 2 half square triangles. With my 2 lines sewn, it's now time to cut apart my square and create my 2 half square triangles. I can cut them apart with my rotary cutter and ruler or with a pair of scissors. I'm going to be cutting on the line that I drew, so right between those 2 lines of stitches that I made. Now all that's left is to press and trim our half square triangles. At this point, you can either press, then trim using a square ruler, something like this one over here, or with a slotted trimmer's ruler. I have videos on both of these methods on my YouTube channel, so feel free to check them out. So if you're going to use a slotted trimmer's ruler, you're going to want to trim and then press. With this, what I like to do is I like to trim from the scrappy side up. That way I get to see what it's going to look like once I trim it off. I am going to decide right about here is a good spot. Okay. Now you want to press. It can be really tempting to press towards the background fabric. It's going to be a nice crisp press. You don't have all of these crazy seams from your scrappy pieces, but I will recommend you press open. Because there's so many seams, it can be kind of thick, and it can be really beneficial in your project for the half square triangles to be a little flatter. So I recommend pressing them open. If you are a lover of pressing to the side, you can still do it. It's just going to be a little bit thicker when you're trying to sew the pieces together. You might not get quite as crisp of points on your half square triangles. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to press open. I'm going to use my finger to help kind of move along that seam before I get there with the iron, just helping to make sure that I capture what side everything should be on. That what should be on the left stays on the left, and what should be on the right stays on the right. If you don't have the slotted trimmer's ruler and you're going to be using a square ruler, you're going to want to press your half square triangle first. So with the slotted trimmers, we trim then press. This is our finished block. And now with the square ruler, we're going to press then trim. Again, I have full videos on how to do this, much more detail, much less fast paced than I'm doing right now, but you can watch those from my channel. So with this one, I'm going to go ahead and line up. I need them 6 inches. Line up the diagonal and trim. There we are. So with this one, I'm just going to cut off the other dog ears. This side was pretty straight, so I didn't have to trim anything, which is kind of a bonus when that happens. And now I have 2 Scrappy half square triangles that I made. You can use them this way, you can use them this way. This would be kind of fun. This way, make some funky geese. You can use them in all sorts of projects. I have tons of tutorials on my website as to how you can incorporate these into your next project. And I would love to see your creativity as well. So if you do something with them, please comment on my blog or comment down here in the video. Let me know what you've done. I love to hear about it. Again, I'm Eliane from Patchwork and Poodles. Thank you for joining me today as we made some scrappy half square triangles together.